Hello. Welcome to another incredible journey here on our channel. Today, we have an unbelievable story about a police officer who attacks a war veteran. You won't believe the shocking twist when the officer discovers the elderly man's true identity. To make sure you never miss thrilling stories like this, hit that subscribe button right now. Your support is crucial for us to keep bringing you high-quality content. Don't forget to drop a like and turn on those notifications so you'll always be in the loop. Let's dive into this adventure together. John Matthews walked down the street slowly, his body a testament to the years of service he had given to his country. The weight of his military history weighed on him in ways that only someone who had been through the horrors of war could understand. The calluses on his hands were not just from hard labor, but from holding a rifle through countless battles. Yet now, walking in the streets of downtown Los Angeles, he was invisible to the crowd, a shadow among many. The younger generation didn't know his name, and even if they did, they didn't care. The city buzzed with the hustle of life, and he was just another old man lost in the crowd. As the sun set over the city, John could feel the warmth of it on his face, but it wasn't enough to mask the deep loneliness he felt inside. His heart heavy with memories of the past, he thought about the things he had seen, friends he had lost, battles fought, and the constant battle to be respected as a human being. Yet, despite the weight of all that he had done for this country, he found himself constantly fighting for dignity in his golden years. He had been through hell, and yet, the hardest battle of all was being seen for who he truly was. It was a battle that continued every day, even in the streets he had once fought to protect. His mind wandered to the family he had once hoped to build, but now, years later, his only company was the cold wind and the distant hum of city life. He had given everything, and yet, society seemed to have moved on without him. As he crossed a busy intersection, his mind returned to the present, only to hear footsteps approaching from behind. They were fast and determined, the kind that signaled someone was in a rush or, perhaps, had something to prove. Without warning, a police officer stepped into his path. The officer's uniform was sharp, his expression even sharper. "Hey, old man, what are you doing here?" the officer barked. His voice was harsh, filled with a mix of suspicion and disdain. John looked up, trying to make sense of the situation. "I'm just going home, young man." "Had lunch with some friends," John replied calmly, though the tone of the officer's voice made his blood pressure rise. The officer, Officer Torres, looked him up and down, as if assessing whether John was a threat or just another person to be ignored. His eyes narrowed. "Going home? With a face like yours, you don't look like you belong around here." John's eyes flashed, a deep well of anger bubbling just beneath the surface. But he kept his voice steady. "I believe I have the right to be here as much as anyone else. I'm just trying to get home." Torres stepped closer, his chest puffed out as if trying to assert his dominance. "I don't think you understand. People like you aren't supposed to be in places like this. Why don't you go back where you came from?" John's fists clenched at his sides, but he refused to rise to the provocation. He was a soldier, a man who had fought for this country, and this disrespect was too much to bear. "You don't know who I am," John muttered under his breath, but Torres didn't hear him. Instead, the officer's eyes flashed with disdain as he pushed John aside. The force of the push made John stumble, his cane clattering to the ground as he tried to steady himself. A few bystanders glanced over, some even taking out their phones to capture the scene, but no one stepped forward. John was on the ground, feeling the weight of his age and the sheer humiliation of the moment. As he struggled to regain his balance, he realized something important. This was no longer just about the physical push. It was about something deeper, something more ingrained in the fabric of society. The humiliation of being treated as less than human. The loss of dignity that so many veterans, especially those of color, felt every single day. John took a deep breath, trying to steady his pulse. He refused to let this moment define him. He wouldn't let it. "You don't know who you're dealing with, young man," he said, his voice steady but filled with authority. Torres laughed, dismissing John's words. "Yeah, okay, whatever. Get up, and go on with your day." But even as Torres turned to walk away, there was something in his eyes, something that suggested he had no idea who John truly was. And in that moment, as John stood, his face bruised but his spirit unbroken, he knew that the story of his life wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of the battle for his dignity. Later that evening, John sat alone in his apartment, nursing the bruises from the incident. He had been through far worse during his time as a soldier, but there was something different about this. Something that stung deeper than any physical wound ever could. It wasn't just the pain in his arm or the scratch on his face, it was the fact that, despite everything he had done for this country, he was still seen as nothing more than a nuisance by some. He had spent years fighting for freedom, for justice, for the country he had once believed in. But now, it seemed that the very freedoms he had fought for were slipping through his fingers. As he sat in his small living room, staring at the flickering television, he couldn't shake the feeling that his service had been forgotten by society. He had served his country with pride, fought in wars no one should ever have to fight in, but none of that mattered to people like Officer Torres. It was clear now that his age, his race, and his status as a veteran meant nothing in the eyes of some. The more he thought about the officer's words, the angrier he became. He had tried to stay calm, but it was becoming impossible to ignore the injustice of it all. Why was he being treated this way? Was it because he was old? Because he was a black man? Or was it simply because some people had no respect for veterans, especially those of color? John didn't know the answer, but what he did know was that he wouldn't let this go. He wouldn't let this moment pass without making his voice heard. And so, he picked up his phone, dialing the number of his grandson, Marcus, who had been his rock for years. Marcus answered on the third ring. "Grandpa, hey, what's going on?" His voice was warm, comforting. "I need you to help me with something, Marcus," John said, his voice steady but with a hint of frustration. "I'm going to fight this. I can't let it go." Marcus was quiet for a moment, clearly trying to process what John was saying. "What happened, Grandpa?" he asked cautiously. John paused, the weight of the situation sinking in. "I was attacked today, Marcus. By a cop. And I won't let it slide." Marcus's response was immediate, filled with anger and concern. "That's messed up, Grandpa. I'll help you. You're not alone in this." John smiled weakly at the support, grateful for his grandson's unwavering loyalty. Together, they would make sure this incident didn't go unnoticed. Together, they would fight back. The next day, Marcus arrived at John's apartment, determination etched on his face. "We're going to take this to the streets, Grandpa. We'll get the support we need. You've been through too much for this to go unchallenged." John looked at his grandson, his heart swelling with pride. Marcus had always been his rock, the one person who truly understood him. Despite the generational gap, they had always found common ground. Marcus's optimism, his belief in the power of justice, was infectious. Together, they would find a way to make sure the world knew what had happened. Marcus spent the next few days gathering evidence, reaching out to local civil rights organizations, and contacting a lawyer who specialized in cases involving police misconduct. He knew this was going to be a long and difficult fight, but he also knew it was one worth fighting. As the story began to gain traction, the media took notice, and John's case began to be discussed in local news outlets. Soon, people from the community were offering their support, signing petitions and organizing rallies. It was clear that this incident had struck a chord with many, especially those who understood the struggles of Black veterans in America. As Marcus and John sat down to review the growing number of messages and support they were receiving, John felt a sense of hope he hadn't felt in years. The outpouring of solidarity reminded him that, despite the darkness he had encountered, there was still light in the world. He wasn't alone in this fight. He never would be again. Unwavering loyalty. I know, Marcus. But this isn't just about me anymore. It's about all the veterans who've been forgotten, all the men and women who've fought for this country, only to be treated like we don't matter. Marcus sighed, his voice heavy with emotion. I get it, Grandpa. I do. But we'll make sure the world knows what happened. I'll get in touch with some people, start gathering evidence. We'll take this to court if we have to. John nodded, his resolve growing stronger. I need you to help me find a lawyer. Someone who can understand this fight, who will take it seriously. I want the world to see what happens when a man who gave his life to this country is treated like dirt. The next morning, as the sun rose over the Los Angeles skyline, the weight of what John had decided to do began to settle into his bones. He wasn't just going to let this injustice go unnoticed. He was going to speak out. His reputation as a veteran, his dignity, and his very identity were on the line. The decision he had made the previous night felt like a turning point in his life, a life that had been shaped by battles fought on foreign soil, but now, a battle of a different kind awaited him. He dressed carefully that morning, his movements slower than they once had been, but precise. Every detail mattered now, and as he looked into the mirror, he straightened his jacket and ran his fingers over the medals pinned to it. These were the symbols of everything he had accomplished, everything he had sacrificed. He would not let them be tarnished by this senseless act of disrespect. John's phone buzzed. It was Marcus, calling with an update. Grandpa, Marcus said quickly, I found someone. A civil rights lawyer who specializes in cases like yours. They're on board, and we're ready to take action. John felt a sense of relief wash over him. For the first time since the incident, he felt like he wasn't facing this alone. Good, he said. Let's do this. We can't let them get away with it. The battle was just beginning. John knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he was ready. He had been through worse, and this time, he wouldn't back down. It was time to stand up, for himself, for all veterans, and for everyone who had ever been unjustly treated. The following weeks were filled with the kind of tension that only a legal battle could bring. John Matthews, now fully committed to seeking justice, met with his lawyer, Michael Thompson, a seasoned civil rights attorney who had spent years fighting cases of police brutality and racial discrimination. Michael was passionate about his work, and from the moment he met John, he knew this case was personal. It wasn't just about winning, it was about doing what was right. Michael's office was a small, modest space in downtown Los Angeles, with walls lined with books on law and justice. He had seen his fair share of injustice, but something about John's case struck him differently. This was a man who had served his country honorably, only to be humiliated by the very system he had fought to protect. John, Michael said, sitting across from him at the table, this is going to be a tough fight. The police officer you're accusing will likely try to claim he was just doing his job, but we have something he doesn't, the truth. John nodded, his expression unwavering. I didn't ask for this fight, Michael, but I won't back down. I know what's right. And I know that officer needs to face the consequences for his actions. The days that followed were filled with long hours of preparation. Michael and his team scoured through video footage from the incident, spoke with witnesses who had been present during the confrontation, and began compiling the necessary evidence to build a strong case. Meanwhile, John's story began to gain attention. The video of the incident had gone viral, sparking outrage among people across the nation. Support for John's cause grew as social media users rallied behind him, calling for justice for the elderly war veteran. But not everyone was supportive. There were those who criticized John for making a big deal out of nothing, while others dismissed the situation as just another case of an elderly man causing trouble. Some even attempted to discredit John's military service, questioning whether his past had any relevance to the current incident. These attacks only made John more determined to fight. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of legal meetings, John sat alone on his porch, staring out at the Los Angeles skyline. He had never imagined that his final years would be spent fighting this kind of battle. But here he was, and he wasn't going to let anyone dismiss his sacrifice, not now, not ever. "Grandpa, you okay?" Marcus's voice broke through his thoughts as he stepped onto the porch. John smiled faintly, though the weight of the situation was still heavy on his shoulders. "I'm good, Marcus. Just thinking about the road ahead." Marcus sat beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We've got this. You've got this. You're not fighting alone." John looked over at his grandson, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the support he had. He had been through wars, seen things that no man should ever see, and yet, it was this fight for justice, that felt like the most important one. And with Marcus by his side, he knew he wasn't alone. The battle for justice was far from over, but John was ready. He had fought for his country once, and now, he would fight for what was right. As the days went by, John Matthews' case gained more traction. His story was plastered across news outlets, social media platforms, and online forums. People from all walks of life shared their outrage over the video of John being pushed to the ground by Officer Daniel Torres, a young cop whose aggression had shocked the nation. Support for John, particularly from veterans and civil rights groups, was growing by the day. It wasn't just about the incident anymore, it had become a symbol of the systemic issues plaguing the relationship between law enforcement and marginalized communities. But with all the attention came resistance, particularly from the police department. Officer Torres, once the subject of public scorn, was now being defended by his colleagues and higher-ups. The narrative was quickly shifting. Instead of taking responsibility for his actions, Torres and his supporters were painting him as a victim of unfair treatment. They claimed that John had provoked the altercation, that his refusal to cooperate with the officer had led to his aggressive actions. According to them, Torres had been simply doing his job in a dangerous environment. "He's just an old man with a chip on his shoulder," one of Torres's colleagues said in an interview, defending the officer's behavior. "You don't know what kind of people he deals with every day. He had to take control of the situation." These statements, which seemed designed to deflect blame, enraged John and his supporters. How could they try to justify what had happened? John had been nothing but respectful, even in the face of blatant disrespect and aggression. Still, the more Torres and his team denied responsibility, the more determined John became to expose the truth. Marcus had been working tirelessly to build their case. He had contacted witnesses who had been present during the incident, collected video footage, and even interviewed people from the neighborhood who knew John and could vouch for his character. The evidence was stacking up, but the more they prepared, the more John realized how deep the issue ran. It wasn't just about one officer, it was about a system that allowed these kinds of abuses to go unchecked. And that was something he couldn't ignore. One afternoon, John sat in his lawyer's office, staring at the files in front of him. He had been through wars, battles of unimaginable proportions, but this fight, it felt different. It felt personal. Every document, every piece of evidence, felt like a piece of his dignity on trial. Michael Thompson broke the silence. "We've got some solid evidence here, John. The video footage is clear. The witness statements are compelling. But I need you to understand something, this is going to get ugly. They're not going to back down, and they'll do everything they can to discredit you." John exhaled slowly, his hands gripping the edge of the table. He'd seen this before, people trying to tear down those who spoke the truth, trying to turn the tables and place blame on the victim. He wasn't going to let that happen. "I didn't come here to be a martyr," John said quietly. "I came here to make sure what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else. I want accountability." Michael nodded. "And we're going to get it. We'll take this to court if we have to, but I need you to stay strong. This fight is far from over." As John walked out of the lawyer's office, he felt a mix of determination and exhaustion. He had come to a realization: this wasn't just about seeking justice for himself, it was about fighting for everyone who had been wronged. The path ahead would be long and filled with obstacles, but he wasn't going to back down. The media storm surrounding John Matthews' case only intensified with each passing day. News outlets across the country picked up the story, and it quickly became a hot topic of debate. Pundits and commentators weighed in, offering their opinions on whether or not John had been treated unfairly. Some supported him, calling for the immediate firing of Officer Torres, while others questioned whether the incident had been blown out of proportion. On social media, hashtags like #JusticeForJohn and #VeteransMatter began trending, with people from all over the country expressing their anger over the way John had been treated. Many veterans, particularly black veterans, saw John's story as a reflection of the systemic issues within law enforcement, particularly regarding the mistreatment of black and elderly individuals. There were countless messages of solidarity, and some even organized rallies in support of John's fight for justice. But for every voice that supported him, there were others who questioned his version of events. "The guy was probably just confused," one user commented on a viral video of the incident. "Old people don't always know what's going on." Another said, "He probably provoked the officer." Cops have a tough job. They have to do what they can to stay safe. The divisive opinions played out in the media, with some outlets attempting to paint John as a troublemaker and others highlighting the sheer absurdity of what had happened to him. To many, it was clear that the incident was not about a simple misunderstanding, it was about the power dynamics between the police and the community they were meant to protect. But as John's story became more widely known, it also became a lightning rod for debate, with people taking sides in a polarized climate. Despite the public scrutiny, John remained resolute. He knew that the fight wasn't just about his own dignity, it was about exposing the truth of how far some people were willing to go to protect the police officer who had wronged him. He saw the media frenzy as a reflection of a larger problem, one that stretched far beyond his own personal experience. It was a battle for fairness, respect, and the very soul of the country. As the days turned into weeks, John's legal team prepared for the first hearing in his case. It was a crucial step in their fight for justice, and the tension was palpable. John spent hours preparing, going over every detail of the incident, rehearsing his statements, and reliving the trauma of that day. It wasn't easy, but he knew it was necessary. The world was watching, and it was time to show everyone what had really happened. On the day of the hearing, John arrived at the courthouse with Marcus by his side. The air was thick with anticipation as they entered the building. The courtroom was filled with reporters, supporters, and a few of Officer Torres's colleagues. John could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him, but he didn't falter. He was here to tell his truth, and he wasn't going to let anyone stop him. The judge entered the room, and everyone stood in unison. John's lawyer, Michael, stood beside him, ready to make the case. As the proceedings began, John felt a sense of calm wash over him. This was what he had been fighting for, to be heard, to have his story validated. The tension in the room was thick, but for the first time in a long while, John felt like he was in control. He had fought for his country, and now he was fighting for his dignity. The first hearing didn't bring a resolution, but it was a crucial step forward. It gave John the opportunity to present his side of the story, and it allowed the public to see just how far he was willing to go to seek justice. It also became clear that this case wasn't going to be easily dismissed. There were too many people watching, too many voices demanding accountability. As they left the courthouse, John and Marcus exchanged a look of determination. This fight wasn't over yet, but they were one step closer to getting the justice John deserved. As the court case continued, the story of John Matthews and Officer Daniel Torres captured the attention of the nation in ways no one had predicted. The courtroom was a battlefield, and John was no longer just a victim, he had become a symbol of something much larger. His case represented a broader fight for justice in a country where, for too long, the voices of marginalized communities had been ignored. People from all walks of life, from veterans to activists, were rallying behind him, demanding not only accountability for his mistreatment but also systemic change in how the police interacted with the public. The media storm was relentless. News outlets broadcasted updates after every hearing, and social media was alive with hashtags and viral videos. John became the face of an unwelcome reality for many in America, the disparity between the treatment of Black Americans and others in encounters with law enforcement. It was clear that this was no longer just a local incident, it had become a national conversation. But despite the overwhelming support from the public, John's journey was far from smooth. There were growing tensions as some individuals, particularly from the police force, tried to dismiss the case as just another isolated incident. Yet, as the case went on, it became harder for anyone to deny that there was something deeply wrong with the way John had been treated. Officer Torres, who had been an arrogant presence at the outset, was now struggling to maintain his composure in front of the press and in court. His defense team, initially confident in their ability to deflect blame, was starting to show cracks. John was no longer just fighting for personal justice. He was fighting for every person who had been wronged by the system, for every citizen whose cries for accountability had gone unheard. As public outrage reached a fever pitch, people were demanding changes to policing policies. The case had sparked a movement, one that transcended John's individual experience and addressed systemic issues at the heart of law enforcement practices. It wasn't just the media that was rallying behind John. Community leaders, political figures, and organizations that had long advocated for reform in policing were now stepping up to lend their support. It was an overwhelming feeling for John, who had spent most of his life serving others. Now, he was at the center of a battle that felt much bigger than himself. But despite the noise around him, John remained focused. He had come too far to back down. As the protests and rallies gained momentum, John sat with his lawyer, Michael Thompson, in their office, the weight of what lay ahead heavy on his shoulders. "This isn't just about you anymore, John," Michael said softly. "This is about making sure no one else has to go through what you did." John nodded, his resolve growing stronger. "I know," he replied. "That's why I have to keep going. For all of us." The courtroom drama reached a boiling point when the defense team for Officer Torres was forced to confront a series of damning revelations. It had been discovered that Torres had a history of aggressive behavior in previous encounters, incidents that had been overlooked or swept under the rug by the police department. A string of past complaints surfaced, shedding light on a pattern of misconduct that had been ignored until now. For John, this was the turning point. The realization that Torres wasn't an isolated case, but part of a larger culture within the police force, struck him like a hammer. He had always known that his case wasn't just about one bad officer, but to see the evidence laid bare before the court was both empowering and heartbreaking. The system, it seemed, was rigged to protect officers like Torres, to turn a blind eye to their actions until the damage was too great to ignore. As the trial continued, the pressure on Torres mounted. The once confident and defiant officer now seemed smaller, his posture slumped as the weight of the evidence against him took its toll. The courtroom became a stage for the unraveling of a narrative that had been carefully crafted to protect him, and with every witness that took the stand, his defenses crumbled. The press, who had once been divided in their coverage, now rallied behind the idea that justice needed to be served. John, however, remained calm. He knew that this was only one piece of the puzzle. The case was far from over, and despite the public outcry, there was still a long road ahead. But for the first time since the incident, he allowed himself a brief moment of hope. The cracks in Torres's armor were visible now, and with each new revelation, it became clear that the officer's days of avoiding accountability were numbered. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Torres was called to the stand to testify in his own defense. As he stammered through his responses, trying to explain away his actions, John watched intently, feeling a surge of empowerment. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment when the truth would be revealed, when the world would finally see the officer for who he truly was. But the real turning point came when the prosecution introduced a video, footage from a body cam worn by another officer present at the scene of John's assault. The footage was shocking. It showed Torres's behavior in its full, unfiltered ugliness, capturing not only the aggression toward John but also the disdain and condescension he had shown to others in similar situations. This was the smoking gun that everyone had been waiting for. With the video now in evidence, it was clear that Torres's days as a police officer were numbered. The media erupted with outrage, the public's support for John reaching a fever pitch. This wasn't just a victory for one man, it was a victory for the countless others who had been mistreated, ignored, or silenced. The scales of justice were finally tipping in the right direction. The final day of the trial arrived, and the anticipation was palpable. John sat in the courtroom, his body exhausted but his spirit unyielding. He had fought for so long, for so many, and now it was time for the final reckoning. Officer Torres's defense had crumbled, and it was clear that justice was within reach. But even as the judge began to deliver the verdict, John couldn't help but reflect on everything that had brought him to this point, the long hours of preparation, the sleepless nights, and the weight of knowing that his story wasn't just his own, but part of a much larger fight. As the judge delivered the verdict, the room fell silent. Officer Daniel Torres is found guilty of misconduct, excessive force, and abuse of power, the judge stated, his voice firm. This court finds that his actions were both unlawful and unjust, and he is hereby dismissed from the force. John's heart pounded in his chest. The victory was bittersweet, and as he turned to face his lawyer, Michael Thompson, he saw the faintest smile on the lawyer's face, a smile that told him everything he needed to know. The system had failed John in the past, but today, it had worked as it was meant to. Outside the courthouse, the media swarmed John, and the crowd erupted in cheers. People hugged him, patted him on the back, and thanked him for his bravery. But for John, it wasn't the applause that mattered. It was the knowledge that his fight had made a difference. The country was watching, and change was coming. It wasn't over yet, but it was a start. As John left the courthouse that day, he did so not as a victim, but as a victor. And in the distance, he could see the horizon, wide, open, and full of possibilities. The road ahead would still be long, but now, John knew he wasn't walking it alone. Thank you all for following John's journey. What did you think of the story? Please leave a comment below sharing your thoughts. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories like this, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. Stay tuned for more.